Hello and welcome to Herbal History. In this episode, we'll cover 4 ancient herbalists. These figures include, in order, Dioscordius, Galen, William Turner, and finally, Nicholas Culpeper. Let's start with Dioscordius. Pandanius Dioscordius lived around 2,000 years ago. He was a traveling doctor that traveled all throughout the Roman Empire, collecting different local medicinal herbs everywhere he went. He wrote the book De Materia Medica, the most famous herbal, which is a document talks about herbal medicine in Western history. Due to the better information found in Dioscordius' book De Materia Medica, his work became the reigning view of medicine for over 1,500 years. De Materia Medica was a 5-volume book that was translated into several languages, both ancient and modern, and was utilized by European, Middle Eastern, and Indian authors as a baseline book to build from. Dioscorus was born in 30 AD. Around 50 AD, he began work on his De Materia Medica. It was finished and published in 70 AD, and although it was written in Greek, it was quickly translated into other languages such as Arabic. Dioscordius died around 90 AD. Unlike the works of other classical authors, the Materia Medica never left circulation and was not destroyed during the Dark Ages, and as such, never had to be discovered. Dioscordius created and listed well over 4,000 types of medicines made from plant, animal, and mineral origins. And his book, unlike contemporary books, actually did testing and put an emphasis on experimental data, while his contemporaries relied mostly on divination. His contemporaries also mixed up the names of different drugs, used misleading information, and many other things. Unlike his contemporaries, Dioscordius went to every location and personally studied each and every herb used by local tribes and groups for medicine purposes. He was also the first herbalist to divide medicines by their modes of action, a process copied by many authors all across the Old World. His book also included plant names, synonyms, illustrations, the plant habitat, the botanical descriptions, the properties, actions, and uses of the drug, and the negative side effects of said drug. He also wrote about how to find adulterations with different medicines and potential veterinary uses. Now on to Galen. Galen was a physician and biologist who was referred to as the father of experimental physiology. His expertise during that time period was neurology, pathology, logic, philosophy, anatomy, and physiology. His knowledge of ancient medicine was second only to Hippocrates. Galen was son of an architect named Aius Nikon. During that time period, he studied philosophy, but Aius had a dream that the god of medicine wanted him to send his son to study medicine, and so Aius sent Galen to study medicine. Aius died shortly afterwards. Galen later spent a decade studying and practicing medicine in Greece. He later studied anatomy in Alexandria, Egypt. He later became a surgeon to the gladiators. He later on worked for Marcus Aurelius, and later became the personal doctor of Emperor Commodus and the later Emperor Septimus Severus. He also used public theaters to give demos on how to perform experiments on animals. He used animals because dissecting humans had become illegal. The animals he used were mostly pigs and monkeys. During this time, a plague hit Rome due to it being caught during a battle in the Near East. Galen, unlike his contemporaries, simply recorded the symptoms and used the symptoms to diagnose the diseases. This method worked better than the doctors who used divination to figure out what diseases the returning soldiers had. This created resentment among rivals. During his lifetime, Galen wrote at least 400 books, however only about 80 of them survived. And the 80 that have survived have been translated into many languages. One of the best known books is called On the Natural Facilities. His knowledge was so great that even the errors found in these books were considered true by scholars and philosophers until at least the Middle Ages. But some of his ideas still persisted well into the Renaissance and even into the 1800s. Galen was also the first one to discover that blood flowed through arteries, not air. He died at the age of 70 at 199 AD or 200 AD, although some sources say he was a bit older when he died. Now on to William Turner. William Turner is often referred to as the father of English botany, since he was the first writer in England to have written a book on botany that had a scientific basis to it. Since all English botanical works were based on European plants exclusively, Mr. Turner's first book was called The New Little Book on Plants, described plants mostly found in England, which were never mentioned in other botanical texts at that time period. Because Mr. Turner refused to accept the teachings of the Church of England and was a vocal proponent of the Protestant Reformation, he was jailed for 2 years and was later exiled to the continent, and all his published works were destroyed in the process. During his time in exile, he met with many botanists throughout the continent of Europe. After Henry VIII died, William Turner returned to England and became the personal doctor of the Duke of Somerset, and in 1551, he wrote the first volume of his Herbal, The New Book on Plants. When Edward VI died, Queen Mary took over, and she had no tolerance for Protestantism. And so William Turner's books were banned again, and he was exiled again. After 5 years in exile, he would return to England and publish the second part of his book, but spent the rest of his life in Cologne due to no longer trusting the English government, alongside the fact that he had more information available to him in the form of different plant anatomy sketches written by Mr. Few from which to study from. He completed his third volume of his book before dying in 1568. His 3-volume work described over 200 species of plant native to England, and as such described plants that were not described in prior time periods. The arrangement of the herbal is alphabetical, with each plant being written first and foremost in its scientific name. Now on to Nicholas Culpeper. Amongst the herbalists mentioned before, Mr. Culpeper's is the most tragic amongst them. He was born in 1616 to the Reverend Nicholas Culpeper Sr. and his wife Mary. His family was of noble origin and owned a lot of land. Unfortunately, his father died 2 weeks after Nicholas Culpeper Jr. was born, leaving the young junior to live with his mum on their own. During this time period, medical knowledge was only limited to a privileged few, specifically the licensed physicians, and was influenced by his grandfather, the Reverend William Attersole. His grandfather had ambitions of sending his grandson to Cambridge and was a devout purist. He later discovered the late William Turner's Herbal, sparking an interest in medicine. His grandfather later forced him to try to go and become a theologian, of which the young rebel showed little interest in. This schism between him and his grandfather led to Nicholas Culpeper being disowned by his grandfather and denied any of his family's inheritance. Culpeper madly fell in love with another wealthy lady named Judith Rivers. Due to Nicholas Culpeper being a disgraced individual now, thanks to his grandfather, Mr. Culpeper and Miss Rivers decided to elope, where they would escape to the Netherlands and settle there. This did not, however, work out, since, in a twist of fate, Judith Rivers' coach was struck by lightning, killing her, causing Nicholas Culpeper to become a reclusive individual. Later on, his mom died from breast cancer, and so Nicholas Culpeper became an apprentice to a herbalist doctor, who spent much of his time cataloging various medical herbs. He also studied astrology through the works of William Lilly. Mr. Culpeper later married Alice Field in 1639. During this time, he set himself up as an astrologer, botanist, and physician for the poorest of society, much to the chagrin of the other doctors. During his time, he saw 40 patients a day and charged very little or nothing at all for his services. In 1640, his grandfather passed away and left him only 40 shillings, as one last act of spite. In 1642, the English Civil War was upon them, and so Nicholas Culpeper became the field surgeon due to his medical knowledge, and eventually captain of his own infantry. He was later shot by a musket, and though the Puritan side of the Civil War was victorious, Mr. Culpeper's days in the battlefield were done, and he went back to being a doctor. He personally believed and acted upon the idea that medical treatment should not be limited to just the privileged class, sparking controversy among his fellow physicians, who viewed him as a traitor. Mr. Culpeper translated the Pharmacopoeia Londinensis from Latin to English, a prospect frowned upon by the College of Physicians. He later on wrote a book called A Physical Directory in 1649 to make herbal medicine available for those who needed it the most. He later wrote many more books, which to this day continue to be of use in the medical field. He also published an instruction manual for midwives, something that was lacking during that time period. His most famous work, however, is The English Physician, which was renamed The Culpeper's Herbal. Unfortunately for him, his health deteriorated due to the wound he received on the battlefield, and he perished January 10th, 1654, at the age of 38, leaving behind his widow Alice, and although he fathered 7 children with her, only one child named Mary would outlive her father. Well, that ends our episode. Hope to see you in the next one.